Hi, this is Stuart Weems and welcome to the Investopoly podcast. My goal is to give you simple, easy to understand strategies, insights and tips to help you master the game of building wealth. And in this episode, I'd like to talk about retirement. It's something that most of us dream about and look forward to. And unfortunately, I'm going to be the bearer of bad news. Perhaps retirement might not be as enjoyable as you might think. And you need to think through it a little bit more carefully. So the reason or the idea of this podcast topic came out of my recent appearance on the Australians Money Café podcast. So that's a podcast I do every now and again with the editor, James Kirby. Anyway, they listeners write in with their questions and we get to answer them. And the week before, someone had a question about the FIRE movement. FIRE is an acronym that stands for Financially Independent Retire Early. And essentially it means, save as much money as you possibly can, as quick as you possibly can. So spend as little as you can to try and get into retirement as early as possible. And, the FIRE movement, maybe people are in their 30s by the time they retire and so forth. Anyway, a listener that worked in the mental health sector wrote in the week that I was on the show and said that she would actively discourage people from retiring early and instead maybe consider working less, but retiring actually provides a lot of benefits to a person's wellbeing and mental health. And so that's we talked about that question or that response on the podcast. You can obviously check that out, but my response was that I recall a UK study from 2013 that found that retirement increased the probability of suffering clinical depression by about 40% and a physical health condition by 60%. So certainly the studies seem to suggest that retirement might not be as fantastic as one might first think. And when most of us sit back and think about retirement, we think about being able to spend the whole day doing whatever we want. No deadlines, no emails, no meetings, no obligations. And as we sit back today in our working life, we think that looks pretty appealing. But the problem is, for a lot of people, the honeymoon retirement wears off pretty quickly. And it's not uncommon for people to feel, a few different negative feelings like a loss of self-worth because, most of us, our occupations contribute a lot to how we define ourselves. I'm a financial planner, I'm a lawyer, I'm a surgeon, I'm a CEO. That's who I am, and that's why I'm adding value and I'm important and I'm contributing and so forth. And when we retire, we kind of, to some extent, or a lot of people, lose that kind of self-worth or self-identification, and that creates some problems. We actually miss the daily routine. The daily routine of travelling to work, meetings, deadlines, etc., adds structure to our day. And without that structure, people can be left feeling bored, aimless and isolated. We find that the hobbies perhaps just aren't enough. So, hobbies and interests are great pastimes while we're working because they often help us relax and socialise and so forth. However, once we stop working, we might find that we want activities that offer more than just that relaxation and socialisation. Or finally, if your expectations of retirement are different to your spouse, that can create conflict as well. So, for example, if one spouse is quite happy to sit at home and the other spouse wants to go travel the world, that can create some issues and problems as well. And I think, people, when they think about retirement, they think naturally, and I'd like to encourage you to, of course, to financially prepare for retirement. But I think also retirement also requires some emotional preparation and just some practical preparation to really think through what am I actually going to do in retirement. So, which invites me to turn to the question then, why? Why do we have these problems? Why do people, or some people really struggle in retirement to really enjoy it? Well, I remember reading something that Tony Robbins put together. So that's the speaker and coach, written lots of books and so forth. And he's adapted Maslow's hierarchy of needs to derive 6 human needs. So the 6 human needs to his mind are certainty, variety, significance, connection/love, and growth. And the 6th one is contribution. And it's the last 2 that are often fulfilled by our occupation. So growth, so personal growth, and contribution beyond ourselves. So let's talk about those 2 things then. So growth really refers to, our desire to constantly learn and improve. If that's what you've been doing in your occupation, in your career, then growth will be a really important thing for you to think about in retirement. So if in your career you're constantly striving to learn more at work, expand your capability, do work that you're proud of, strive for promotions and so on, they're the sorts of hallmarks that suggest that personal growth is actually important to you and your well-being. And so you need to then think about, how are you going to fulfill that need in retirement, and that could include finding paid or even unpaid employment, something that you really connect with. So you're not doing it for the money, you're really doing it for the connection. Of course, you could study or take up a new hobby or travel the world or so on. Could be some of those things or all of those things, but something you really need to plan for and think about. The last one was contribution, and contribution really refers to the sense of service and focus on helping and giving and supporting others, contributing to something beyond yourself. And as Tony Robbins says, living is giving. I like that catchphrase. So if a contribution is actually important in your paid employment, so if you're working for a business, organisation or so forth that allows you to make a contribution to a certain cohort or people or whatever, and that level of service gives you a lot of personal satisfaction, then you'll need to look for alternate ways to satisfy that contribution element to again improve your well-being. So some suggestions could be looking after family or friends that really need your assistance, volunteering or starting your own charity for a cause that you're really passionate about. Again, it's really about identifying what is my employment offering, and if it's offering that contribution element, how am I going to replicate that in retirement to maintain my well-being? And so they're the 2 sort of main ones, contribution and growth. But also connection can be important too, which is another one of Tony Robbins' 6 human needs. It reminds me that many years ago, when I was back in university, for my economics major, I wrote a paper on a Dutch professor called Geert Hofstede. One of Hofstede's theses was that people go to work mainly for social connections just as much as anything else. So therefore, if you don't really have an extensive and close sort of friendship family group, you might find yourself feeling a bit isolated or lonely in retirement, particularly if your spouse continues to work, if you retire before they do or you don't have one. So perhaps continuing to work really does provide that connection, and that's something you're going to have to think about as well. I remember a mate of mine contemplated partial early retirement when he was in his 30s, and the problem was that everyone else, all his mates were still working, so there was no one to go and play golf with and so forth. So connection can be probably the third one to really think about. So another way to look at the retirement goal is not absolute retirement, but maybe partial retirement or semi-retirement. And it's something that's becoming a lot more popular over the years, particularly last 10 years, and even more so really since COVID, as we've all got to kind of reflect on our lives and day-to-day living and so forth. So that could consist of continuing in your current occupation, but just doing fewer hours, so maybe pulling back to 3 days a week or something like that, assuming you still connect and really enjoy what you're doing. Or alternatively, it could be pursuing alternative occupation, again, something that really resonates with you, that you connect with in terms of the work. So something, again, that you're maybe doing more for the connection or more for the satisfaction than for the money. But often those alternatives might actually provide lower remuneration. So whether you do that 5 days a week or fewer really depends. But they're the sort of ways of looking at maybe semi-retirement and actually working either part-time or reducing your working income and delaying full retirement. Not only adds a lot of positivity to your mental and physical and personal well-being, which is kind of the topic of this podcast, but also has a massive impact from a wealth accumulation perspective. So really, in terms of a wealth retirement strategy, there's kind of three. We can kind of think about it as three phases. The first phase is investment acquisition. So that's when you're younger. It's really about investing heavily in super, buying investment properties, investing in the share market. It's really about getting or accumulating or investing more and more growth assets. The second phase is really what I would call consolidation, and that might be, gradually repaying loans, but mostly just letting the assets have enough time to do their thing, to enjoy or benefit from compounding capital growth. And of course, the third stage is retirement. Retirement obviously is when we either spend the income that our portfolio generates and or eat into some of the capital, depending on what the situation may involve. So the consolidation phase is actually quite important. And the more time that you spend in that phase, the greater the financial impact. So, for example, if I had a client that could work to 60 and then start retirement there, full retirement, for example, compared to if they worked, say, part-time for another 5 years, just enough to pay for living expenses, so they didn't need to dip into any of their financial resources, but allowed their assets to compound and grow for another 5 years. The difference to that is, in most circumstances, surprisingly substantial. So not only are there some personal benefits, in terms of our well-being, but the benefits associated with, a semi-retirement phase are substantial as well. But putting the numbers aside for a second, really the theme of this podcast is to really think carefully of what does retirement look like for me? How am I going to replace the growth and contribution and maybe even connection needs, or how am I going to replace them as a result of not working anymore? And the answer to that could be a variety of things, including maybe semi-retirement first rather than full retirement. I recall listening to a speech by a media personality some years ago. It's probably 20 years ago now. And he was, the event was sort of celebrating his retirement. And he said when he went home and told his wife, that he was going to retire, she turned around and said to him, well, I don't care what you do in retirement as long as you don't do it at home. And it made me laugh a little bit, but it does raise a good question. What are you going to do in retirement? And maybe your spouse doesn't want you to do it at home, but I don't know. But the point, of course, is really just to think carefully about what retirement looks like to you. Is it full retirement? Is it partial retirement? Do you really want to just keep working as long as possible? Maybe not in the occupation that you're doing now, but maybe doing something that you really connect with. My personal approach, for what it's worth, is I'd love to continue working as long as I possibly can. Certainly not 5 days a week, probably eventually 2 or 3 days a week, but I'd like to do that for as long as humanly possible. And interestingly enough, I was listening to another podcast, Tim Ferriss' podcast actually, and the interviewee, which was Jim Collins, a fantastic author, was talking about Peter Drucker, which again was a management author, wrote about management and so forth. The Effective Executive was his most popular book. Anyway, by the time he was 60, he only completed a third of his work, his writing and so forth, and he still had many, many books to come. When Jim Collins met him in his 80s, he subsequently wrote 10 more books. So I guess that story just sort of showed, well, maybe you can keep contributing beyond yourself well into your 60s, 70s and 80s, and that's what I hope to do. But anyway, let's see what happens. Okay, until next week, bye for now.